Vivian Ashford stepped onto the plane with a face carved from ice, furious that a booking mistake had dropped the most powerful woman in American aerospace into the economy cabin. The seat beside her belonged to Owen Rourke, a single father in a worn jacket, carrying a notebook full of blueprints her company had once tried to bury. She planned to ignore him for the next 3 hours. But when the plane shuddered and a warning light blinked where no warning should exist, Owen said something that made Vivian go still. The very system she was about to buy could bring down the empire bearing her name. If you believe one chance encounter can rewrite a person's whole future, hit subscribe and stay with us for this flight nobody was supposed to survive unchanged. Vivian Ashford had been on her way to Seattle to preside over the final vote on a merger worth more than $1 billion when her assistant called in a family emergency, leaving her to book her own ticket for the first time in years. Distracted by a board call and thumbing through an airline app between sentences, she selected the wrong fare class without noticing, and by the time she caught the error, every first class and business seat on the route had already sold. The next available flight would make her miss the vote entirely, so she had no choice but to board the only option left to her. Her assistant had handled every travel arrangement for nearly a decade, and Vivian realized, somewhat uncomfortably, that she could not remember the last time she had navigated an ordinary airport terminal without a driver waiting curbside and a staff member clearing her path through security. The unfamiliarity followed her down the jet bridge, past rows of passengers who did not step aside for her the way employees did in the marble lobby of Ashford Meridian's headquarters. And by the time she reached her assigned row, her jaw had already tightened into the expression her staff privately called the closed door. She settled into her seat with visible irritation, unused to cramped rows, unfamiliar voices, and a world that did not immediately recognize her as someone who mattered. A child cried somewhere near the back of the cabin, a cart rattled down the narrow aisle, and the recycled air carried none of the quiet calm she associated with the private jet she usually favored for cross-country trips. The man beside the window wore a jacket gone soft at the elbows, held an old phone with a cracked corner, and kept glancing down at a notebook filled with technical drawings. Vivian decided within seconds that he was ordinary, a maintenance worker perhaps, someone she would not need to remember past the flight, and she filed him away with the same quick dismissal she applied to interns and rideshare drivers. Owen, for his part, had no idea that the sharp-eyed woman folding herself into economy ran one of the largest aerospace companies in the country. Nor would he have cared much if he had known, having spent years growing immune to the particular gravity powerful people expected strangers to feel around them. When she asked him, in the clipped tone of someone used to instant compliance, to trade seats so she could sit undisturbed by the window, Owen declined politely, explaining that he needed the view of the wing for reasons he did not elaborate on. It was not rude. It was simply final, delivered with the same even calm he might have used to decline a second cup of coffee, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, a total stranger had told Vivian no, and meant it without offering an apology or an explanation she could argue against. She studied him for a beat longer than necessary, waiting for the usual backpedal that came once people realized who they were speaking to. But Owen had already returned his attention to the small window beside him, as though the conversation had fully concluded. She turned back to her laptop, opened the merger documents, and began scrolling through diagrams she had reviewed 100 times before, irritation still humming quietly beneath her practiced composure. Owen's eyes drifted sideways, caught a familiar shape on her screen, and closed his notebook before she noticed him looking. The image was unmistakable to him, a seat-locking assembly he had once helped design, now rendered in someone else's corporate slides. Something in his posture changed, a stillness settling over him the way it did before he delivered bad news to people who did not want to hear it. He said quietly, almost to himself, that she should not buy that system, and the words landed in the narrow space between them like a stone dropped into still water. Vivian turned toward him fully now, certain he was either fishing for attention or trying to impress her with borrowed knowledge, and she asked, in a voice meant to end the conversation, what qualified him to remark on a deal worth more than $1 billion. Owen did not argue the point. He simply tapped a spot on her screen, indicating a secondary locking mechanism that existed in the original design, but had vanished from the commercial version she was about to purchase. Startled, Vivian closed the laptop and warned him not to look at confidential material again, and Owen apologized, though he added that he recognized the design because he had helped build its earliest version years ago. She studied him for a long moment before revealing her name and title, half expecting flattery or nervous backpedaling, but Owen only sat with the information for a few seconds before asking whether she had read Technical Report 7B. Vivian had never heard of it. He did not press the point or explain further, mentioning only that he was flying to Seattle for a final mediation meeting with his former employer, and that he had no interest in using their chance seating to beg for a job or a settlement. His indifference unsettled her more than eagerness would have, and she called him a disgruntled former employee, a label she used easily and often. Owen did not flinch. He simply returned to jotting notes about sounds coming from somewhere beneath the cabin floor, as though her opinion of him mattered less than what his ears were telling him. The conversation revealed two people built from opposite convictions. Vivian believed power meant controlling every variable in a room. Owen believed disasters happened precisely when powerful people chose to ignore the variable they found inconvenient. She measured people by the title printed beneath their name. He measured them by what they did when no one else was watching, a philosophy proven moments later, when an elderly woman in the row ahead struggled with an overhead bag and Owen quietly helped her without waiting to be thanked. Vivian watched the exchange without remark, filing it away somewhere she would not admit to checking later. Then Owen heard it again, a faint metallic release beneath a row near the aisle, subtle enough that most passengers would have mistaken it for ordinary turbulence noise. But Owen had spent enough years around these mechanisms to recognize the sound the way a parent recognizes a child's particular cough. He leaned forward, read a manufacturing stamp near the base of the seat track, and recognized it immediately as an experimental module belonging to the very company whose merger papers sat closed on Vivian's lap, a detail that struck him as far too coincidental to ignore. He sat back slowly, running the math in his head, aware that a flight carrying an early production unit of the flawed system might be exactly the kind of evidence no lawyer or spreadsheet could ever replicate. The aircraft eased into a patch of light turbulence, and the seatbelt sign flicked on with its familiar chime, the kind of moment most passengers absorbed and forgot within minutes. Owen noticed something the others did not, an irregular shift in a cluster of seats several rows ahead, a motion too deliberate to be wind. He did not attempt to fix anything himself or leave his row, choosing instead to summon flight attendant Dana Pike and describe, with exact and unhurried language, the sound, its location, and the possibility that the floor-locking mechanism was not fully engaged. Dana hesitated at first, aware that he was only a passenger, but something in his precise vocabulary convinced her to relay the concern to the flight deck without delay. The crew cross-checked the system readouts and quietly asked two passengers in the affected row to move, all without alarming the rest of the cabin. Nobody was hurt, and a ground technician was patched in through the cockpit to confirm the anomaly. Vivian watched the entire exchange and recognized that Owen was not trying to manufacture panic. He had even asked Dana to keep the announcement minimal so other travelers would not grow frightened over something manageable. When turbulence spiked again moments later and an overhead bag nearly slipped free, Owen steadied it calmly and guided the frightened woman beside him through slow, even breaths. Vivian was afraid too, though she worked hard to hide it, gripping the armrest with a stillness she had perfected during years of tense negotiations where showing fear meant losing leverage. Owen did not mock her effort, nor did he pretend the aircraft was perfectly steady simply to comfort her. He told her plainly that fear was not weakness, that pretending otherwise was usually what led people into poor decisions at the worst possible moment, a lesson he said he had learned the hard way long before he ever worked in aviation. Vivian asked, almost involuntarily, whether he was ever afraid during his years designing systems meant to save lives in exactly these situations, and Owen admitted that the fear never fully disappeared. It simply became something he had learned to work alongside rather than against. When the aircraft finally settled, Dana returned to confirm that the captain had in fact detected an inconsistent warning signal in the exact row Owen had flagged, evidence that his instincts were not guesswork, but trained recognition built over years of studying exactly these kinds of failures. She thanked him quietly, glancing at Vivian with a look that suggested she already sensed something shifting between the two passengers in row 31. He opened his notebook again, this time allowing her to see it fully, revealing a seat-locking design with two independent layers of protection, a redundancy meant to prevent catastrophic failure during rapid evacuation. The sketches were dense with annotations in two different sets of handwriting, one clearly his own, the other smaller and more precise, and Vivian would later learn the second hand belonged to Mara, who had mapped human reaction times onto every mechanical detail Owen drew. The commercial version Ashford Meridian was preparing to purchase had only one. Vivian's eyes moved to the corner of the page where an approval signature was scrawled beneath the original blueprint, and her breath caught when she realized the name did not belong to Owen at all. It belonged to Sterling Voss. Owen told the rest of it without turning it into a long confession, choosing his words the way a man chooses them when he has told the story too many times to strangers who did not believe him. 7 years earlier, he and his wife, Mara Rourke, had developed a modular seating system meant to speed emergency evacuations and better support passengers with limited mobility, Owen handling the mechanics while Mara studied how people actually behaved under panic. Aerovanta Systems purchased development rights to the prototype, and Voss initially promised the safety standards would remain untouched through production. When costs began climbing beyond budget, Voss ordered the engineering team to strip out the secondary lock entirely, and Owen refused to sign off the change. He remembered sitting across a conference table from Voss, watching the man explain in calm, reasonable tones that a single redundant lock added weight, cost, and manufacturing delay that the board would not tolerate, as though safety were simply another line item to be trimmed for the sake of a quarterly forecast. Owen had argued that the redundancy existed precisely because a single point of failure was unacceptable in a system meant to protect passengers during an emergency evacuation. But the argument fell on ears that had already made their decision long before the meeting began. Within a week, he was suspended for what management called missed deadlines. His formal safety report vanished from internal records, and the design was registered solely under the company's name. Colleagues who had once eaten lunch with him in the Aerovanta cafeteria stopped returning his calls, uncertain whether association with him might cost them their own positions, and Owen learned quickly how fast a reputation could be dismantled once the right people decided it should be. Mara fell seriously ill not long afterward, a diagnosis that arrived within months of his suspension and swallowed whatever fight he had left in him, and Owen spent what savings and energy remained caring for her and raising their daughter, leaving no resources to pursue a drawn-out legal fight against a company with far deeper pockets than his own. He remembered the particular exhaustion of those years, working odd shifts around hospital visits, filling out insurance paperwork at midnight while Tessa slept in the waiting room chair beside him, and watching the woman who had once run complex evacuation simulations for a living slowly lose the strength to walk across their own kitchen. After she passed, Voss offered him a settlement in exchange for silence, a sum large enough that most people in Owen's position would have taken it without hesitation, and Owen turned it down anyway, telling the company's lawyer that some things were not for sale regardless of the number attached. From that point, his professional record quietly filled with negative reviews that made every future job harder to find, references that described him in vague, damaging language no one would ever let him formally dispute. Vivian remained skeptical, asking why he had waited until now to speak up rather than raising the alarm years earlier. Owen answered with 3 points delivered evenly. He had already sent warnings that were ignored more than once. Aerovanta was only now preparing mass production of the flawed system, and the merger itself would transfer full legal exposure onto Ashford Meridian the moment the papers were signed. Vivian reopened the contract on her laptop and found the liability transfer clause exactly where he described it, buried in dense language deep within an appendix no one on her team had flagged as urgent. She began to understand that Voss was not merely selling a product with a flaw. He was selling a legal disaster with her company's name already stamped on the receipt, and the realization sat in her stomach like cold water. Vivian connected to the aircraft's onboard internet and sent the report code to her general counsel, Leona Beckett, hoping for a swift correction to what she still wanted to believe was a misunderstanding. Leona's reply arrived minutes later. No report bearing that code existed anywhere in the company's official archive. Vivian suggested, not unkindly, that his evidence might have been fabricated, understanding that no chief executive could stake a company's future on the word of a stranger met by accident in row 31. Owen did not take offense at the caution. He recognized it as the same discipline that had once made him refuse to sign a document he knew was wrong. He handed her an encrypted drive containing original correspondence between the engineering team and Sterling Voss, failed test results, meeting minutes documenting the order to remove the secondary lock, an electronic receipt proving he had once filed a report with federal regulators, and research data from Mara's own studies on evacuation timing. He did not let her copy the entire drive, offering instead a verification code so Leona could confirm file creation dates and digital signatures without exposing everything at once. Vivian asked why he carried such carefully organized proof onto an ordinary flight, and Owen admitted that he had learned, painfully, never to walk into any meeting connected to Aerovanta without documentation strong enough to survive being called a liar. He had rebuilt the archive twice after losing access to company servers, piecing it back together from personal email threads, old voicemails he had transcribed by hand, and copies of Mara's research notes she had kept on a home computer separate from her office files. Leona located a copy of the report buried in an old archive absorbed during a previous acquisition, its status quietly altered to read invalid rather than deleted outright, a distinction that struck Vivian as almost more damning than an outright deletion would have been. Someone inside Aerovanta had taken care to make the report technically retrievable, while ensuring no automated compliance search would ever flag it, a level of deliberate concealment that suggested more than one person had been involved in burying the truth. Vivian asked Leona to pull the access logs for that specific file, wanting to know exactly who had touched it and when, and Leona promised results before the aircraft reached its descent. Before she could dig further, Sterling Voss learned that Vivian was asking questions and called her directly, his tone smooth and practiced. He claimed Owen had struggled emotionally since his wife's death, clashed repeatedly with supervisors, and was now attempting to extort the company through manufactured claims. Vivian watched Owen's face as she listened, and he made no move to grab the phone or defend himself with raw emotion, asking only that she put one question to Voss directly, who had signed the order removing the secondary lock from the production model. When she asked it aloud, Voss deflected, pivoting instead to threats about how any delay would tank Ashford's stock by the time markets opened again. He added that the board was prepared to proceed with the vote without her if she failed to appear on schedule. And for the first time, Vivienne understood that her own itinerary might have been arranged so she would arrive only in time to rubber stamp a decision already made without her. She asked Voss quietly whether he had personally reviewed the liability clause buried in the merger appendix, and the brief pause before his answer told her more than any words that followed. He insisted the language was standard boilerplate used in nearly every acquisition of this size, a claim Owen quietly disputed by shaking his head, having reviewed enough merger contracts during his engineering career to know exactly how unusual that particular phrasing was. Voss shifted tactics again, reminding Vivian of the years her father and his own family had spent building trust between their two companies, suggesting that unraveling the deal now would embarrass a legacy far larger than one disgruntled engineer's grievance. Vivian felt the old pull of that argument, the one that had guided so many of her decisions since taking over the company, the fear of being the Ashford who broke something her father had spent decades assembling. But she found herself measuring that fear against the sound of rattling overhead bins and Owen's steady voice describing a lock that might fail exactly when hundreds of strangers needed it most, and the old argument suddenly carried far less weight than it once had. Leona sent a photograph of an internal document moments later, its final line stating plainly that once the acquisition closed, any claims tied to Owen Rourke's original design would become Ashford Meridian's sole legal responsibility. The conversation slowed after the contract reveal, giving both of them room to say things they usually kept locked away. Vivian admitted she had spent months defending the merger because she wanted the board to see her as tough enough to inherit her father's empire, believing that any failure would give Graham Whitlock exactly the excuse he needed to push her out of the chair she had fought so hard to earn. Owen asked a simple question in return, wanting to know whether signing a contract that made the company less safe was really protecting her father's legacy, or simply protecting her own seat at the table. Vivian bristled at first, but she could not argue the point away, and she found herself describing her father, Alistair Ashford, a demanding man who nonetheless believed that power only meant something if it made other people safer. She remembered him walking factory floors long after he could have delegated the task to junior staff, insisting on shaking hands with the people who actually built the aircraft rather than only the executives who sold them, a habit his successors on the board had quietly abandoned within a year of his passing. She had believed in that version of leadership once too, before years of boardroom battles slowly reshaped her into someone who measured success only by control, quarterly numbers, and the ability to silence dissent before it reached the press. In return, Owen offered a shorter account of life after Mara's death, working night shifts so he could care for his daughter Tessa during the day, turning down settlement offers because he refused to let his daughter grow up, believing silence was the price of survival. He described briefly the way Tessa had once asked him why he did not simply take the money Aerovanta offered and move somewhere new, and how he had struggled to explain to an 8-year-old that some debts were not measured in dollars. Vivian asked what he had told her, and Owen admitted he had simply said that some promises outlive the people who made them, a line he had borrowed without shame from something Mara used to say about her own work. Vivienne looked at his worn jacket and coach ticket differently now, understanding they were not evidence of failure, but the visible cost of a man who refused to trade his principles for comfort. Owen's view of her shifted as well, recognizing that she had not personally known about the buried report, that beneath her sharp edges was someone still brave enough to examine facts that could unravel her own career. A careful trust began to form between them, not yet love but something steadier, and Vivienne offered a quiet apology for how she had treated him when she first sat down, plain and unpolished but sincere. Leona's voice cut through the moment, informing Vivienne that the board vote would begin in 17 minutes, and that Whitlock had already instructed the legal team to lock her out of the merger files. Vivienne now faced three paths forward. She could sign the deal and keep her seat secure, delay the vote quietly, and risk being removed without ever explaining why, or expose the safety failure publicly and confront both Voss and the board members who had shielded him. Owen did not tell her which path to take, asking only that she not use his name as a bargaining chip unless she was prepared to protect every engineer who had once been pressured into silence alongside him. Vivienne asked Owen to join the emergency board call as a witness, and he hesitated, since meetings like this one had cost him his career the first time around. She put 3 commitments in writing before he agreed. Ashford Meridian would not attempt to buy his silence. An independent investigation would be launched immediately, and every engineer connected to the original design would be shielded from retaliation. Owen accepted, and the call connected through the aircraft's onboard system moments later. Whitlock's irritation was audible the second he realized Vivienne was calling from economy class, and Voss wasted no time dismissing Owen as a disgruntled maintenance worker chasing a payout. Owen did not answer anger with anger, walking the board calmly through the testing history, explaining why the secondary lock mattered, and describing the exact malfunction the aircraft itself had just experienced hours earlier. He spoke the way he once briefed junior engineers, breaking the sequence of events into pieces small enough for people without his training to follow, and several board members who had entered the call annoyed at the interruption found themselves leaning toward their screens instead of reaching for the mute button. One director, an older woman named Priscilla Doyle, who rarely spoke during routine votes, interrupted to ask Owen directly whether he was suggesting the company had known about the flaw before offering the merger terms. Owen answered without hesitation that the internal emails Leona now held in her possession showed exactly that, dated months before the acquisition papers had ever reached the board's desks. Voss attempted to redirect the conversation toward Owen's personal history, suggesting the grief of losing a spouse had left him prone to exaggeration and conspiracy, a tactic that had worked on smaller audiences in the past. Leona confirmed that his documents carried valid digital signatures and verifiable timestamps, undercutting any claim that the evidence had been invented for the occasion. Voss argued that the failure only occurred under rare conditions, and Owen replied that no industry serious about safety was allowed to call a risk rare when millions of passengers would be exposed to it every year, a line that seemed to land with several board members who had grown quiet during the exchange. Priscilla Doyle asked pointedly whether Voss could confirm on the record that he had never seen the internal test results Owen was describing, and Voss's answer grew noticeably vaguer than his earlier confidence had suggested. Whitlock, uninterested in further debate, called for an immediate vote, and the early tally showed a majority still willing to push the acquisition through despite everything just laid bare, a result that told Vivienne exactly how much work still remained before the truth would matter more than momentum. Before the vote could be finalized, Vivienne invoked her emergency authority as chief executive to freeze every transaction tied to an undisclosed safety risk, a move that stunned even her closest allies on the call. Whitlock warned that the decision could get her suspended and cost the company $75 million in break clauses, numbers he clearly expected to frighten her into reversing course. Vivian answered that $75 million was a smaller price than the cost of a defective system installed across thousands of aircraft carrying ordinary families. She revealed the liability transfer clause Voss had buried deep in the appendix, reading the exact language aloud so no board member could later claim confusion about what they had nearly approved, and several members visibly shifted as they realized Aerovanta intended to hand Ashford the entire legal burden the moment ink met paper. Priscilla Doyle asked whether outside counsel had reviewed that specific clause before it reached the board, and Leona confirmed that it had been added during a late revision that never circulated beyond a small internal group close to Voss himself. The room grew quieter with each new detail, the earlier momentum toward approval draining visibly from faces that had seemed certain only minutes before. Leona reported new evidence showing that someone on Voss's team had altered the status of Report 7B just 3 days before the merger documents were sent to the board for approval, a timeline that made accidental oversight almost impossible to argue. Voss lost his composure at last, accusing Owen of manipulating Vivienne, and for the first time his polished exterior cracked in front of the people who had always trusted his word, his voice rising in a way none of them had heard from him before. Whitlock, who had spent the earlier part of the call pushing hardest for an immediate vote, went uncharacteristically silent, watching the man he had championed for years unravel in real time. Owen did not rise to the accusation, instead asking Voss to explain why a safety study bearing Mara Rourke's name appeared inside an Aerovanta patent filing with no credit given to its original author. Voss's silence answered the question more completely than any denial could have. Vivienne suspended the acquisition on the spot, ordered every relevant file preserved, and notified federal aviation regulators of a preliminary safety concern, while Voss was removed from the call pending formal investigation. Whitlock promised to convene a hearing to reconsider her position as chief executive, and Vivian accepted that risk without argument. When the call ended, Owen asked quietly whether she regretted what she had just done. Vivian looked out across the rows of economy passengers around her and answered that it might be the first decision in years she did not regret at all. The aircraft began its descent, corporate tension easing into something quieter and more personal as the cabin lights dimmed for landing. Vivian learned that Ashford stock was already reacting to leaked news of the suspended deal, and that a small crowd of lawyers, board members, and reporters was gathering to meet her the moment she reached Seattle. She offered Owen a substantial sum to purchase his design outright, and he refused, unwilling to repeat the mistake of handing full control to a corporation without real transparency built into the arrangement. Vivian adjusted her offer instead, proposing that Owen lead an independent new safety laboratory with authority to rehire the engineers once pushed out of Aerovanta, that the design carry both his name and Mara's, that all testing data be made public to regulators, and that a portion of future profits fund support programs for single parents working in the aviation industry. She spoke through the details slowly, watching his face for any sign that the offer sounded like another attempt to buy his silence with a nicer title, and Owen listened without interrupting, weighing each provision against the years he had spent distrusting anyone connected to executive leadership. Owen did not agree immediately, insisting that every commitment be drafted formally by Leona and approved by a genuinely independent oversight board before he would sign anything, a condition Vivian accepted without argument. He added one further request of his own, that any engineer who came forward with a safety concern in the future be guaranteed a formal review process outside the normal chain of command, so that no one else would have to wait years and lose everything before being taken seriously. Vivian agreed to that as well, recognizing it as the same principle her father had once tried to instill in a company that had slowly drifted away from it. Vivian smiled for the first time since boarding, telling him that his caution was precisely why she needed him involved at all. Leona confirmed separately that Owen's damaged professional record could likely be proven retaliatory, meaning years of being labeled a difficult engineer might finally be corrected on paper as well as in reputation, a possibility Owen had stopped allowing himself to hope for long ago. He asked what that correction would actually look like in practice, and Leona explained that it could mean formal letters to the licensing boards and industry references who had relied on the false reviews, along with a public acknowledgement from Aerovanta itself once the investigation concluded. Owen said little in response, though something in his posture eased slightly, the tightly held caution of a man finally allowing himself to believe an old wound might close. Vivian, in turn, stopped treating the chief executive title as something to be defended at any cost, willing now to lose it if that was what returning the company to its founding values required. She found herself thinking less about how the board would remember her decision and more about how her father would have judged it, a shift in priorities that felt both unfamiliar and strangely like relief. Just before landing, she received word that Whitlock's position had softened unexpectedly. He no longer wanted her removed. He wanted to negotiate instead. The plane touched down safely in Seattle, gliding along the runway with none of the drama that had marked the flight only an hour earlier, and Dana thanked Owen for his early warning, confirming the affected seating module would be inspected before the aircraft flew again. She told him, quietly and without any obligation to do so, that his call had likely spared the crew a much harder conversation with regulators down the line, and Owen simply nodded, uncomfortable as always with praise he had not asked for. When the cabin door opened, passengers could see a small crowd of attorneys and assistants waiting at the gate for Vivian, and Owen finally understood the true scale of the power the woman beside him carried into ordinary rooms. Rather than stepping straight into the waiting group, Vivian paused to help Owen retrieve his worn travel bag from the overhead bin, a small gesture that meant more than either of them said aloud. In front of her own staff, she introduced him not as a former Aerovanta employee but as the engineer who had just stopped Ashford Meridian from making the worst mistake in its history, a description that marked the first real step toward restoring his name after years of quiet erasure. Several of her assistants exchanged startled glances, unaccustomed to hearing their chief executive credit anyone so openly, let alone a man in a jacket gone soft at the elbows standing beside a battered travel bag. Owen shook the hands offered to him without any visible discomfort, though the attention itself felt foreign after years of being dismissed in rooms exactly like this one. Leona handed Owen a preliminary agreement outlining his legal protections, his role in the coming investigation, and his intellectual property rights, and he agreed to participate immediately while withholding his signature on any long-term contract until his own lawyer had reviewed every clause. He explained that he had learned not to sign anything quickly, regardless of how sincere the person offering it seemed, and Vivian told him she would have been disappointed if he had done otherwise. Vivian prepared to face a board meeting that could end her career, while Owen prepared to face the very company that had spent years trying to erase his, both of them walking towards separate confrontations they might have avoided entirely just 3 hours earlier. Before they parted at the gate, Vivian asked whether he would be willing to sit beside her on the flight home. Owen glanced toward the business class boarding area and told her only if she booked the tickets correctly this time. Vivian answered that next time she would deliberately book 2 economy seats instead. The investigation confirmed that Sterling Voss had personally directed the concealment of the safety report, the alteration of internal records, and the transfer of legal liability onto Ashford Meridian, resulting in his removal from Aerovanta and a wave of civil lawsuits alongside a formal regulatory inquiry. The merger collapsed without forcing Ashford to pay the full penalty, since Aerovanta had violated its own disclosure obligations from the start. Vivienne kept her position as chief executive, though she dissolved the advisory group focused purely on short-term profit and established an independent safety council with real authority to halt any product that failed to meet proper standards. Owen became director of the newly formed Ashford Rourke Human Safety Lab, accepting the role not for its salary but for the chance to build a workplace where engineers could raise concerns without fear of losing everything. The seating design was registered again, this time under both Owen and Mara Rourke's names, and at its public unveiling his daughter Tessa appeared briefly to see her mother's name engraved on the laboratory wall. She traced the letters with her fingers for a long moment before asking her father whether her mother would have been proud, and Owen told her that pride was too small a word for what Mara would have felt watching her research finally protect the very people it was designed for. Vivienne arrived without an entourage that day, choosing to stand quietly near the back of the room rather than at the podium where her staff had expected her. The relationship between her and Owen deepened slowly over months of shared work, quiet conversations after hours spent reviewing test data, and trust rebuilt one honest action at a time rather than through any single dramatic gesture. Whitlock, true to his word, negotiated a truce rather than a removal, though he never fully forgave Vivienne for the $75 million penalty her decision had ultimately avoided through the collapse of Aerovanta's own disclosure violations. The safety council she formed began reviewing every product in the company's pipeline, and twice within its first year, it halted a launch that engineers privately admitted they had been afraid to challenge before Owen's name became attached to the new standard. The story closed on a flight to Denver for a routine inspection of the new system, where Owen discovered that Vivienne had indeed booked 2 economy seats side by side, complete with a window seat reserved specifically for him without needing to ask. Tessa had come along this time, seated across the aisle with a coloring book, occasionally glancing over at her father and the woman who had slowly become a steady presence in both their lives over the past half-year. Vivienne caught the girl watching them and offered a small, unguarded smile, one that would have surprised any board member who still remembered the closed-door expression she used to wear through every negotiation. She told him the first flight they shared had nearly cost her an empire. He told her it had given him back his life, along with a laboratory full of engineers who no longer had to choose between honesty and their next paycheck. Vivienne admitted that she still thought about the version of herself who would have signed the merger without a second glance. And Owen said he thought about that version too, the one who might have stayed silent rather than risk another confrontation with a company that had already taken so much from him. Neither of them regretted the outcome, though both understood how easily the story could have ended differently had one of them chosen comfort over honesty in those first 3 hours over Chicago. As the aircraft lifted off the runway, they were no longer a powerful chief executive and an unemployed single father thrown together by accident. They were 2 people who had found purpose, trust, and an unexpected future in seats neither of them had ever planned to occupy, proof that the value of a person was never written on a boarding pass, and that sometimes the conversation capable of saving an empire begins with nothing more than a stranger willing to say something true.